Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Freedom Project stream. And today we have Dr. Rupa with us. Hi, Dr. Rupa. Good evening. How are you?
Hi, good evening.
Uh, so, a little bit more about her. She's a postdoctoral fellow at Rochester Institute of Technology in the US, and she's currently working on her project in India with the homeless population. She's also the co-founder of an Enrichment with Suruchi Kothari. She has been a practicing psychologist since 7 years, and she has the experience of working in the US and India, and she has conducted training and she's also a research author. So, good evening, Dr. Rupa. And today, the topic we're going to talk about is change, right? Coping with change. Yeah.
Yes.
So, a general idea of change. Change is a very broad term, right? So, can you give us idea of what is change?
Right. So I think it's important to talk about change mainly because we have so much going on with the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, transitions, changes, differences that come up because of some life event has been very common for us. So we talk about change in terms of not just something difficult has happened like the pandemic has happened, but also some positive changes, right? So if you have a baby, if you get married, all of that also entails changes. So when we talk about change on a broad level, we're
Yes.
talking about like different types. So I'll highlight four types of changes. One being life interrupted change. So in this case, if you've had like a big illness, if you have any kind of accident, if you have a fire in your house, natural calamities, these can interrupt your life. So that's a life interrupted change. We talk about professional changes as well, right? As you grow in your career, as you transition from one job to another, those are professional changes that come about. Lifestyle changes. So we know that we decide at some point of time we want to live healthy, or something happens, we start eating more junk, and our like lifestyle is like changed at that point of time. And transformational changes. Now, transformational changes can be, a new idea that you've had that changes your life. You get into something that, whether it's professional, whether it's personal, it changes your life. Spiritual changes can also be like transformational changes. So when we look at change, we don't necessarily categorize them into these types, but on a day-to-day basis, we are encountering a lot of change in our lives.
Yes. That's true. If we just think, there's change and we don't categorize into different aspects, and then we can't overcome again as well. Um, so, as you said, there are positive and not so positive changes, right? So, what is like, can you give us healthy and unhealthy changes, like classification or
Right.
more idea?
So when we talk about healthy changes, these are more consciously decided upon changes that you are involved in. They can also happen to you, right? Like they can also be environmental changes. They can be, someone else in your life has brought about that change for you. So a healthy change, like I said, an example would be, getting married, having a baby. Again, that's not, not everyone will call it positive changes, but for most people, these are healthy changes. Even, promotions at work, you decide for yourself, you set yourself on a path and you grow in that path, and those can all be healthy changes. The unhealthy or maladaptive changes in that aspect would be, if you encounter a difficult situation and someone starts drinking, someone starts smoking too much, or they're using drugs. That's one healthy kind of changes. Even any other addictive behaviors, like your eating habits have become different, you've stopped exercising, like you're not coping with the change in a healthy way, so that also makes it unhealthy. You get into trouble. Some people may recurringly fall into trouble because of certain behaviors. Those changes are going to be unhealthy for them. This can also be health related, right? Like if you've been diagnosed with diabetes, that's a change, but how you cope with that change can make it either healthy or unhealthy, adaptive or maladaptive.
Oh, okay. So this is again related to like personal change, right? If so, my so what I'm trying to get at is, if changes happen to us, or sometimes changes happen because of us, right? Uh, so can you, give us more about that?
Right. Right. So when we talk about changes happening to us, the pandemic is a great example, right? Like it's something that's happened to us. A lot of it has been out of control. A lot of it has been, uncertainty. We don't know what's going on. We have to anticipate for the change and more change to keep coming. So in cases like that, also like whether you choose to adapt healthily, to use healthy coping mechanisms or not so healthy coping mechanisms is the cue here. So in most cases with the pandemic, a lot of people have adjusted to working from home. A lot of people have said, you know what, it's okay, I'll try and make the most out of this. I'll get into a hobby, I'll get into something else. And they try doing that, even if it's difficult. In some other cases, it's not as easy to cope. Another
Yes, yes.
example of changes that happen to us is all this global warming, climatic changes, environmental changes, which on a day to day level may not be something we're thinking about. But as a generation, as a species, it is something that's happening and impacting us in different ways. So these are changes that we say that happen to us. When you talk about changes that happen because of us, now this can be where we play a more active role in making those changes happen. You might have thought about it, you may have planned for those changes, and in some cases they are unplanned. It's just a next step that happens in your life, and then you think about how can I cope with this change. So change can be, it's a, like you begin in the beginning you said, it's a broad term, right? It can apply to so many life situations, but it is something that happens to us on a day-to-day basis, which we may or may not know how to cope with.
That's true. Um, and like again, when you say like which we can't cope with, so there are again it comes back to the effects of change, right? So how it affects you, like physiologically, psychologically, or socially. Um, so can you give us more understanding about effects of change?
Right. So, changes happen and they impact your life in all different dimensions, in all different areas of your life. So initially, if you talk about physiological changes, like you encounter a change and you may have a stress reaction. You may have like anxiety. You may have some sort of depression that may follow. Now, these changes, depending on how you view them, are they positive? Are they negative? Are they healthy, unhealthy? It'll affect your physiology in that way as well. For example, when we talk about stress reactions, stress is basically our body telling us that something's changing. This is a reaction I'm having. And we try and recognize what is it that's changing around me? What am I feeling anxious about? A lot of times, what happens is the anxiety or the stress reaction is an anticipation of the consequence of the change, not a reaction to the change by itself. Like for example, currently with the situation in India with the rains in Maharashtra, with the rains, it's impacting everyone. So a lot of people, before monsoons begin, may have that anticipatory reaction saying, oh, I'm stressed that monsoon is coming, it's going to affect me and my family, how am I going to cope with the floods, right? So the response is to the consequence of the monsoon as compared to the monsoon by itself. In that case, physiological changes or physiological responses can be, you'll have heart palpitations every time you hear the thunder. Every time, the rain increases, you're going to start panicking, you're going to start preparing for that change. You're going to, tell the people around you to be careful. Going to probably find another location where you can be safer in that situation. So you'll start preparing for that change. Physiologically, again, and having a knot in your stomach, having some headaches, having some aches and pains in your body, feeling tired, sleep getting affected, or not eating, appetite not being great, gastrointestinal issues. These can all be like reactions to anticipating that change that can happen. So that's with respect to physiological change. A lot of people, when we think about, if someone starts coping with that change, drinking alcohol or smoking, that's also physiological change. A lot of people cope with change even by eating a lot of junk food. That's also physiological change. So that's an important aspect to keep in mind, that if there's something that changes physiologically for you, like, you're feeling like, oh, I was sleeping 8 hours yesterday. Today I'm not getting good sleep. Why? Maybe there's some change that's coming up. Maybe there's some change you're anticipating as well.
Yes, that's true. So, in anticipation of the, like, mostly it's anticipation that builds physiological change, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's not the effect. It's not the, like you said, it's not the range itself. It's the events that happen after the range that give uh, more tension or builds up anxiousness and stuff like that, right? Um, so these are the physiological changes, right? So what are like the psychological changes? Like, these again, you said, we start preparing and we think about, like, the worst that can come to us. But,
Yes.
how can, like, more about physiological changes,
Right.
psychological, sorry.
Psychological changes, yes. So psychological changes can come in the way of how you think about the change and how you feel about the change. There are different aspects of it. So when we think about the change, that's where the anticipation, you're thinking about all the what if situations. What if I'm not able to cope with it? What if it's more than I can handle? And these can also happen with positive changes, right? Like if you're due for promotion at work, your thoughts can say, am I actually able to do this? Do I have the qualifications? What if I don't meet expectations, don't meet deadlines, etc., right? So the what if, the anticipation can be your thinking part of it. Emotionally as well, we may or may not be ready for change, or we may already anticipate that I'm not going to like this job. I'm going to feel sad if I leave my current job and move to another job. I'm going to, or I'm expecting extreme joy, right? I'm feeling really happy about the change, but the change may not meet my expectations. So the psychological reactions can be both ways. Also, the other part of it is depending on the intensity of the change. Like when we are also talking about, change can be traumatic for someone, it can be some kind of trauma. Your thought and emotions are going to match that traumatic response as well. So you may either have panic attacks, you may have flashbacks, you may have. So it's about seeing change in that spectrum. It can be like different in terms of intensity, rather than seeing, okay, good change, bad change. Saying that, in this spectrum, where am I at this point of time? How am I feeling about this change? How am I thinking about this change? Another aspect of the psychological part of this is saying that if I'm anticipating that change to be a good change, when it happens, it's not something I'm enjoying. Like a job is a typically good example of this. You're expecting it to be a certain way, it doesn't turn out to be that way. What we try to do is we try to change our thinking about it. Either we go to an extreme saying, I hate this job, or we go to a part where we say, okay, can I compromise, like some parts of it, not like some parts of it. So there's a lot of thoughts and emotions involved in this process of coping with change on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, that's true. So, yeah, and it's a great example you gave with the job. You think even if it's positive, there are still, you build up expectations and expectation is again the key, like that kills your anticipation, or affects the way you think about the world as well, right? Uh, and you also said, it's a spectrum of changes that we go through, either positive or negative, right? And since every person is different, they express or they exhibit their emotions in various manners, right? Uh, so, due to physiological and psychological changes, right, uh, the way we interact with one another, with our peers or with our family members, right? So, how can what are the effects of changes in our social life, or in our interpersonal responses?
Right, right. And if anything changes, I feel like the first people to notice what's changed is, family around you, your friends who say, you're probably not, this is not how you respond usually, what's going on. So, that kind of interaction at that point of time is also important for us to recognize that, oh, something's changing. We may not really notice it right at the beginning, but it may be someone points that out to you. Another aspect of, depending on how these changes are impacting you, um, for some people, they become social, they enjoy interacting with people, talking about these life changes. Like if you think about, marriage, having a child, especially in India, it's a celebration. You become more social, you invite more people, you want people to be a part of this change in your life. However, if it's a different kind of change, if you've been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, you've been diagnosed with a mental health issue, like these can all be changes where there's a tendency to isolate yourself as compared to becoming social. So that isolation can also be a way of coping with that change, where you might be an outgoing, like in a typical sense, an extroverted person, but sometimes you just go into your shell because you're coping with that change by yourself, and you don't want to involve people, or you don't know how people can help you in that situation. So we avoid talking about those changes. So in interpersonal or social context, the isolation is a key that is important to highlight, because we are all social animals, right? Humans are social animals. We are meant to have interactions with other humans. But in changes, in anticipation of changes, now with work from home and with the pandemic, a lot of isolation got built into the situation in our coping mechanism. And that was not something people are comfortable with in general. For some people, it can be enjoyable, for some people, it's not. So it's a very customized response that people can have in their social interpersonal frame in response to any kind of change that takes place. Another part in, like, with respect to social interpersonal impact of change is, if emotions like anger come up, irritability come up, frustration, these are things that impact your relationships, in your relation, like in your, like, romantic relationships, family relationships, relationships with friends, right? So change can also, so it's all related, right? You have the physiological responses, the psychological emotional responses, and that can also affect your social interpersonal interactions with people.
Yes, it's true. And again, like you said, is the first ones to know that we've changed, or we are beginning that change, is others. Like, like you say, uh, it's a very, niche example, but your, like, whatever you eat, if you eat something, your nose is close to your mouth, but then someone else comes to know, like, better. So it's, I think, again, the same thing. Like when you see from outside, it's easier to identify than from within. And
Right.
that is another aspect of, change, what I feel, right?
Yes.
And depending on how good, like, depending on the people that surround you, they either help you with that change or they don't. And then eventually it's up to you to, tackle that change, right? Um, so, and talking about tackling changes, right? So it's either tackling them consciously or unconsciously, right? So there are So sometimes there can be automatic responses to change, like uh, if it's raining outside, then you feel cold, so you wear clothes like warmer clothes. No one tells you to wear clothes, right? So that. So what are some of the automatic responses to change?
Right. So when we talk about coping with change, responding to change, we're talking about our survival mode being activated, right? Like for all of us, when we encounter any change, whether it's positive or negative, we are in that survival mode of wanting to cope with that change, make it a part of our routine, like overcome it in a way that we can be on the other side of it in a more healthy way. So the survival mode is something that definitely gets activated, and depending on the intensity of the change, it can be, how much of that is activated. An important part of it is, like I said, change always comes with some kind of stress response, some kind of automatic bodily response. There are four F's that we usually talk about. So it's fight, flight, freeze, or faint. Okay. When we talk about fight, we say that, okay, if this is a change that has come across, I'm going to take it head on. I'm going to cope with it. I'm going to, increase the resources that I have, use all of my resources to cope with that change. An example for this is, if you've, planned a holiday, you're going to like a national park or something like that, and you know that there are going to be wild animals around, you know that there's some kind of change, threat, danger that's going to be there in that area. So you'll prepare for it in that way, saying, okay, I'm going to fight off, I'm going to be prepared, I'll carry some, object with me, I'll have these guides with me who know this better. You're preparing for it in that way. So that's your fight response. A flight response is also an automatic response where you can either run away from that situation. So you're anticipating a change. So a lot of times, an example that comes up is, I'm getting promoted at my job, but I don't want, I'm scared of it, I want to run away from it. Similar to, wedding jitters, right? Like people have wedding jitters, they say, okay, this is going to be a drastic change, I want to run away from the situation, right? So that's a flight response where you want to get out of that situation and you'll run away. The freeze is basically where, you pause in time, you freeze in the sense that, there's numbness, you're not emotionally responding to that change, you're not able to think about it clearly. The freezing can also involve, excessive sleeping, can involve, like not wanting to interact with this situation anymore. So that's also an important aspect. We don't realize it, but for someone who's encountering change on a regular basis, there's that numbness that sets in where it doesn't impact you, you don't think about it too much, and you just go through the motion of that change. The last one is your faint response. The faint is like a collapse. Like, there's so much of that change that overwhelms your system. You don't have enough resources to cope with it, and you're like exhausted. So you feel your heart palpitations increasing. You might actually have fainting experiences. You may feel nauseous. You may faint because you're thinking so much about it. So that's also an important thing to think about. How, how much of that change is taxing your resources. If you don't have the capacity to cope with that change at that point of time, then it's also about thinking, how can I increase my capacity? Where can I seek help? What can I do to? So we have to always, do that balance, saying, okay, what is the extent of that change? What is the extent of my resources in this moment? So depending on that, we'll have these autonomic responses.
So autonomic. So then again, that gets me to the most common hormone, adrenaline, right? So this is what, uh, we've been taught in school, like fight or flight. It directly correlates to adrenaline.
It's your nervous system. It's your body system that kicks in these responses.
Yes, that's true. And I only knew about either fight or flight, and like when you spoke about freeze and faint, it definitely clicks in the brain, like You either seen someone freeze in the moment and not want to tackle the problem head on. They also don't want to run away from it. So it's like in the middle. So you freeze that aspect and you are like, if I freeze it, it'll go into a shelf and then we forget about it or something like that, right? And faint is again once you it overwhelms you, right? Like you said, and
Yes.
then you can't tackle it, and then you either faint or you have major physiological changes, right?
Yes.
Um, so, so now on to my last question that relates to change is what are effective coping strategies for change, right? So there are many types of changes. So how can we uh, tackle like effective coping strategies for change?
Right. So I'd want to, break down those coping strategies also according to the impact that we spoke. So physiological, psychological, social, interpersonal, these are all areas that get impacted. So we can already prepare for change or cope with change according to these different areas. So, one thing with respect to, change and stress reactions is this fight flight, like, these autonomic responses that we have, right? So if you're constantly, you're eating healthy, sleeping okay, you're able to exercise regularly, all of that like helps your body to regulate its functions, so that even if there is a change that's taking place, even if there's a dire situation, the body doesn't get completely dysregulated. You're able to manage that response. Same goes with, if you're learning yoga, if you're practicing regular breathing exercises, if you're doing, your body scan kind of a thing, checking in how your body is responding to different situations. These things help you assess that change on a physiological basis as well, the impact of that change, while also helping you to cope with it. So physiologically, we always say, irrespective of whether you have a change or not, making sure that your lifestyle is healthy for your body is going to be helpful. Psychologically, again, now depending on the intensity and extent of change, you can, like address your emotions related to the change. If you catch yourself in a thinking loop where you're always picking on the negative aspects of the change, that's also something you can monitor and be more aware of. Sometimes for people, if there's a change that happens, they don't see the positive side because there may be very little positive in that change, or it's an incapability to filter out the positives and negatives. And in that situation, being more aware, being more thoughtful, and thinking about it will be very helpful. Again, having said this, it's not something that we are automatically practicing to do or have the skill to do. So it may be helpful at that point of time to reach out to like a counselor, a psychologist, even to family members to talk about that change, so that you can get your thinking about it a little clearer and also emotionally be able to process that change. The intensity of emotions is also important to identify at that moment. So having that ability to sit with those emotions, if you need to cry, it's all right. If you need to express anger towards that change, how can you do that? So having those conversations. um, in terms of social interpersonal coping as well, right? It's dependent on the people around you, how much support, how much social support you have in that situation. Again, if your family, friends are not able to help you cope with that change, seeking professional help is always helpful. Like, you can talk about it to someone who has an objective lens in that situation, who is not so emotionally involved in that change as your family or friends might be. So it's helpful to reach out to a professional saying, I'm feeling uncomfortable about this change. I'm not feeling great. My sleep is affected. My appetite is getting affected. It may not be like a clinical disorder or an anxiety or depression or anything like that that may show up, but it may be that time frame that is making you uncomfortable coping with that change, and reaching out to a professional just to cope with that is also helpful. It's also an option. People think that going into therapy is for major Like, when you hit that extreme of stress or anxiety or depression, but not really. Even if it's something that's a day-to-day change that you have difficulty coping with, reaching out to a professional always helps.
Yes, that's true. And when you think about, if you get some stomach pain or again relating to physiological, and you immediately want to go to the doctor, you want to be like, oh, I don't want this to turn into a major event that will later again, compromise my health. So the same thing, goes with mental health as well, right? Like you said, change might not be that major, and it won't be a major uh, psychological disorder or major psychological, it won't affect you majorly, but then eventually if you, if it builds up over time, it will definitely lead to something major, right? uh, so thank you so much, Dr. Rupa, for explaining coping with grief or coping with changes so nicely. And the change is definitely something that everyone goes through. It's not selective, and that is true. um, so thank you so much. And if you would like to add anything, like where people can reach out to you, or anything that you would like to share with the audiences before we go, I will anyways put the links to reach out to you in the description below. And
Yes.
yeah,
So I would say, enrichment, like what we're hoping to do with enrichment is for people who don't want to seek individual help or are not there yet where they want to get into therapy, for them to have a space to read more about this. To also, have probably group sessions to talk about this, have trainings on coping with change. Like Suruchi spoke about digital detox. It's again, something that's impacting our generation so much now. So, having a group space or having trainings or, talks or seminars about that, that's what we're hoping to do, so that it's not like the stigma associated with mental health can be taken away a little bit when you're sitting with a group of friends with an expert in the room talking about something like that. And everyone, like you said, everyone experiences change. So it's helpful to, do that in a group setting, talk about it so that you don't feel alone in coping with any of this. So that's the goal with enrichment. So if any of your audience, feels like they have a good group of people, whether it's at work, whether it's just their group of friends who want to have a conversation about this with an expert, learn coping skills, or, even want to like find out more about these different psychological topics, then they can reach out to us on our enrichment page.
yeah, definitely. And everyone that is watching, I will put the links in the description below for reaching out to the enrichment pages, and you can reach out directly to Dr. Rupa or Miss Suruchi, and you can contact them and uh, see the next steps of the process of the process. Um, so thank you so much, Dr. Rupa, for joining us today and helping our audience understand coping with change and change in general. I too have definitely learned a lot from this conversation today, and thank you so much. So I would like to thank our audiences for joining us. If you think you've learned a little bit from this live today, you can definitely share it with people that like it, or share it with people that will benefit from this. You can like the video below. You can subscribe to our channel to see more lives like these in the future. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay safe, uh, and enjoy the